important subject. But before doing that, I want to sort of welcome you all to what is the final session of the Colloquium series this spring as part of the program on education policy and governance. My name is Jim Pizer, former Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, and I'm currently an academic visitor here at the Kennedy School and working in collaboration with Paul Peterson, who is here with us today, and Marty West, who I think is on his way, in order to host this session and the ones that have come before. And I want to say how grateful I am to both Paul and Marty and Antonio and Michael and the whole team to sort of work with me and help me in putting all this together. It's been a real treat. We're ending the spring series on a high note with today's presentation by Dr. Thomas Kane of the Harvard Graduate School of Education and the faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research. His remarks today are entitled, "Did 30 years of education reform truly fail?" And I don't want to steal the punchline, so you may want to cover your ears. I don't see anyone covering their ears, maybe online, turn it on mute. But suffice to say that Dr. Kane's findings suggest that the popular narrative that education reform either failed or was at best a nothing burger is an exaggeration, and in fact, statistically speaking, it's just not true. So given the pressure on standards-based reform right now, both here in Massachusetts and around the country, from both sides of the aisle, really, this couldn't be more timely. After Tom's presentation, we should have ample time for questions and answers and discussion. Even though, and we'll give priority to folks who are in the room here as part of that, but hopefully we'll be able to engage some of the folks online. So if you are watching through the Zoom, feel free at various points along the way appropriately to, in particular after Dr. Kane's presentation, to virtually raise your hand or to put questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to those as well. Also, to make sure all of you know this is being recorded for posterity. It will be posted shortly on the PEPG website. For those of you who are here and want to relive it, you'll have a chance to do so. And for those of you who aren't here, who aren't listening to my words, feel free to obviously click in and watch it at your leisure. And with that, it's my privilege to turn the mic in the program over to Dr. Tom Kane. Thank you, Tom. Welcome.
So thanks, Jim and Paul, for having me. The paper I'm going to be presenting today is largely a descriptive paper. I'm not going to be evaluating the effect of a particular program or a particular policy. Instead, I'm going to be doing something much more ambitious, and that is basically trying to argue that our understanding of what has happened over the last 30 years is inaccurate, and that somehow we've allowed a narrative to develop that that progress is not being made, the gaps are continuing to widen, when in fact on both counts, I think there's that conventional wisdom is wrong, that we have been making substantial progress, and that I'm going to argue that income-based gaps have been closing and present evidence of that, as well as race gaps closing. And then at the end of the paper, the presentation, I'll share some newer evidence on what happened to the average incomes and educational attainment of people in states that saw big increases in the NAEP over time. Now, you might say, like, how in the world could it be 2023 and have this question be an open question about just, what descriptively what has happened over the last 30 years? And the reason is fairly simple, and that is in the National Assessment of Educational Progress, there is not a measure of parents' income or of individual parents' income that we measure family background with things like, parental education, but there isn't parents' income. And the reason is pretty simple, and that is that you can't ask a 9-year-old what their parents' income is. I'd actually be curious to know what my 17-year-old would say if asked that question. And in the law, creating the National Assessment Governing Board, there's an explicit prohibition against collecting and storing parents' names and parents' addresses that would be required for doing any kind of parent survey. So the national data sets that we rely on for tracking achievement over time don't include an income measure. So here, why don't I start with the slides? So most of this work, by the way, is joint work with Shireen Hashem, Thomas Kelly Kemple, and Mary Lasky, who are graduate students at HCSE, and then my frequent co-author, Doug Stager, is part of this too. So Horace Mann famously said that education is the balance wheel of the social machinery. And over the last 30 years, there have been different forces working on that balance wheel. On the one hand, there's more discretionary income at the top of the income distribution. There's actually more income-based residential segregation that I'll show you that spills over into schools. On the other hand, there's been a big push for school accountability, much of which is focused on the lower achieving, lower income schools and school finance reform. But, you know, despite these two different pressures on the balance wheel, a consensus has emerged that income-based achievement gaps have been widening. So if, you know, President Obama in 2013 reported the gap in test scores between poor kids and wealthy kids is now nearly twice what it was, what it is between white kids and Black kids. The National Academy of Sciences issued a report back in 2019 saying, indeed, achievement gaps on standardized tests between high and low income students in the US have grown by 40% in a generation. Now, the main paper that that this is based on is a paper by Sean Reardon at Stanford, who basically took all of the panel data sets that he could identify that included not just a test score, but individual parents' income, and just estimated the relationship between income and achievement, and calculated the difference between 90th and 10th percentile of parental income and reported it. Now, the challenge in this exercise is that each of the different surveys was often measured at different ages of the students. Some were self-reported parents' income, or student reported parents' income, some parent reported income, and just in the midst of trying to adjust and try to make these very different tests comparable, you have to make a lot of assumptions along the way. So a second paper in this literature was by Chris Nielsen in 2019, used the NLSY 79 and the NLSY 97. So these are two surveys that used a similar assessment measure and a similar parental income measure. And when he looked at those 2 points in time, he saw, gosh, things are not widening. I see a flat achievement gap between high and low income folks. Now, the problem with that is actually, you'll see it, Sean Reardon had both of these surveys in his sample and still concluded that achievement gaps were widening, primarily because Nielsen's the period covered by the NLSY only partially overlaps with the period that Reardon sees a big increase. And then more recently, a related literature that Paul Peterson here has been part of and has been tracking gaps by SES, which is a different way to try to measure family background, basically using heavily parental education. But I'd argue that our results are consistent with the SES literature because stable gaps in, for instance, biparental education would be consistent with narrowing gaps by income, because the average incomes of more and less educated parents, that gap was widening over time. So if the gap by parental education was stable, it would be consistent with the gap by income actually narrowing. And we'll actually show you some evidence of that. Okay, so here is Sean's original, just the two key graphs from Sean's original study. He focuses on this period here, the birth cohorts from 1975 through 2001, and notes that when he fits a line there, it looks like there was an upward sloping relationship between the estimated slope parameters and achievement gaps. Here, these two clumps of points are for the NLSY. This is Nielsen's finding, saying, okay, look, over that time period, things seem pretty flat. Now, we're going to be using the National Assessment of Educational Progress to look for evidence of widening achievement gaps by income. And in some ways, the NAEP is ideal because it covers very similar age cohorts to the age cohorts where Reardon sees a sharp increase in income inequality, or achievement inequality associated with income. So we're going to be using the 4th and 8th grade NAEP from 90 through 2015. We're going to be using two different approaches, both with the NAEP data. And first, we identify, we map each of the schools in the NAEP sample to census tracts and infer the mean and variance of income near those schools based on location. And then I'll show you in a bit of like statistical hocus pocus. We'll take the mean and variance of income and achievement to actually calculate the student level relationship between income and achievement. Our second approach is we say, okay, well, let's use the student level characteristics from the NAEP to impute family income via the current population survey. So in the current population survey, we see many of the same characteristics that are measured in the NAEP, and we just say, okay, let's impute family income with the current population survey, and then use imputed family income in the NAEP to just see, you know, what has occurred over time. Even our approach requires strong assumptions. They're just different assumptions. Our two different methods require different assumptions, and they're different assumptions from what Sean had to assume. But both sets of our assumptions, even though they're different, yield the same answer, that achievement gaps were narrowing. Okay, so I'll first talk about method one. So if the thing that we're trying to estimate is the slope with respect to income, if income is Y and test scores are the outcome, we can show that the student level relationship between income and outcome and test scores is a function of actually three things. One is the relationship between mean income and mean achievement at the school level. So what we'll call the between school relationship. So high and low income schools, what was happening to the difference in achievement between them. And then it's also a function of the within school relationship between income and achievement. And you might say, well, gosh, like how the heck are you going to be able to estimate the within school relationship between income and achievement if you don't see any individual kid's income? And here's how, is that the variance in achievement should be like related to the variance in income. So in places where there's wider variance in income, you'd expect to see wider, variance in achievement. And in fact, that proportional, relationship is the square of the within school slope coefficient. And then the third determinant is this interclass correlation in income, which we can estimate with the census data. Okay, we're using the NAEP sample. It's about 125 public schools per state. In fourth grade, 100 public schools per state. In eighth grade, random sample of roughly 30 students per school. We matched each school to census block groups using geographic locations. And our final sample is about 4,800 schools or 128,000 students in the average school grade year. Okay, so jumping past, a lot of just the individual data, here's the relationship between mean school income inferred from the census and mean achievement estimated from the NAEP in 2 years. I've just plotted 1992 and 2015. And what this is saying is, okay, there were increases everywhere. Like, so across the income distribution, there were increases, substantial increases. So like 20 points here is about 2/3 of a standard deviation. So over this time period, there was a large increase, but it wasn't just a shift. You can see a flattening in the between school relationship, which is just saying the difference in mean test scores, the slope with respect to mean income has flattened out over time. That lower income schools increase more. And here, if we just plot all the intermediate years, you can see that this shift was happening gradually over time. Okay, that was, I just showed it for fourth grade math, but if we show it for the other grades and subjects, you can see in eighth grade math, somewhat smaller increases, but the same sort of pattern of shift up and some flattening. In fourth grade reading, same thing, not quite as large. Eighth grade reading, much less progress has been made. But again, no evidence of sharp widening. So remember, if this is all just based on the mean income in the school and the mean achievement in the school, if there were a 40% increase in the relationship between the gaps by income, we would have expected to see something here. And in fact, we see the opposite. We see some flattening. Okay, now what was happening to the interclass correlation, which is just a measure of income-based segregation? There was an increase over time in the interclass correlation that is just, reflecting the fact that there was more and more income-based segregation over time. Now, the, the of the three parameters we have to estimate the relationship between income and achievement. The one that requires the strongest assumptions is this within school relationship between income and achievement. So before I get to that, I would just ask, okay, so the between school was flat or or flattening. The interclass correlation was going up somewhat, but it was still around 0.2. How much would the within school slope have had to increase to generate a 40% increase in the slope with respect to income? Well, it would have had to, if beta between was fixed, it would have had to increase by more than 50%. Now, remember, the relationship we're estimating is not beta within, but beta within squared. So the relationship between income and achievement squared. So that would have had to go up by a factor of 2.25. So what do we see? So this is 1992. This is 2015. Fourth grade math. First of all, so this is just, we're just, school variances in income and variances in achievement are very noisy things. So what we did here was we created a bin scatter where we broke the variance in income into like 20 different categories, calculated the mean variance in income and then the mean variance in scores for that group. And you see, in all four of these grades and subjects, it looks like there was a flattening of the within school slope, or the flattening of a relationship between the variance in income and the variance between achievement. Now, if we put those together, so where we just say, okay, what happened to the between school slope? We estimate, this is fourth grade math, it declined by 25%. The within school slope, we estimate it declined by 60%. Yes, there was an increase in the interclass correlation, but the net effect was the implied student level slope declining by 44% in fourth grade math. And now we start out in these early cohorts, our gap are predicted if we take these slope coefficients and we plug in the 10th and the 90th percentile of income from the current population survey, we see the gap starting out a little over one standard deviation, but by the bottom, by the 2015, that had declined to about 0.7 standard deviations gap between the 90th and the 10th percentile. Okay, so rather than drag you through those same tables for the other grades and subjects, I'll just show you the picture versions. So these are the implied student level relationships for fourth grade math, eighth grade math. Note that what they imply is there was a huge improvement at the 10th, at the bottom percentile, almost a full standard deviation improvement. Still an improvement at the top, 20 points, so like 2/3 of a standard deviation improvement. In eighth grade math, similar story, large improvements at the bottom, also improvements at the top, just not as large. If you do it in reading, what our results imply is that at the top of the income distribution, there was little change in fourth or eighth grade reading scores, but increases at the bottom. Even in eighth grade reading, some small increase at the bottom. Oops. All right. So what was our second approach? So where our second approach was, we said, let's use the race and mother's education variables that are available in the NAEP, as well as the urbanicity and the state of residence. Let's use all of that to just estimate mean income for different cells. And then we'll calculate the mean achievement for that cell. And here we just plot it. So each one of these dots is for a different cell broken up by mother's education by race, by state, and by urbanicity. And so what you see here is I just called out a couple of the points. So this is like the child of a Hispanic high school dropout in rural New Mexico. But, you know, a kid with a parent or mother with these characteristics would be predicted to have fairly low income, and their achievement, when we calculate it in the NAEP for kids who are children of Hispanic high school dropout in rural New Mexico, their achievement is, you know, almost a standard deviation below the average. At the top, these are the child of a white college grad in suburban New York. You see the predicted achievement there. But when we fit the line, this is for the 1992 data. Here's the relationship we see. And then when we do that same thing in 2015, using the imputed incomes from the current population survey in 2015, we see the blue line is the line that we'd estimate in 2015. And I took the 1992 line and I moved it over here to just make it easier to see that it wasn't just that scores increased at all income levels, but that there was a flattening of the slope with respect to income. And that was 8th grade math. This is 8th grade reading. Okay, now if we compare the two methods, we can estimate one of the nice things about the imputed income measures, we can actually calculate the within and between school relationship there too. So we can just say, okay, well, what was happening to the within school relationship between imputed income and achievement? That required a lot fewer statistical assumptions than calculating the within school slope using the geographic, the variance on variance regression. And what we find is, so the dashed line is the CPS imputed. The solid line is based on the census geomatch data. And we see a very, similar pattern. In particular, note, gosh, I keep hitting that. In particular, note that post 2005, we see that's when we really see these slopes going down. Okay, keep that, remember that, because I'll come back to that in a second. So now, over this same time period, race gaps were narrowing. So the black-white race gaps in reading and math in 4th grade were declining. The black-white gaps in reading and math in 8th grade were also declining. By the way, these turned around after 2019 because of the recent pandemic, but at least up until 2019, we were making progress in terms of narrowing those gaps. And one calculation that we've done is we've just said, okay, so how do we reconcile a narrowing of the black-white achievement gap with a dramatic widening in the income gap? Like, what would have to be true in order to be able to see the income gaps and the the race gaps moving in opposite directions. Well, intuitively, you can say, well, okay, the direct effects of race must have been declining, right? So given the relationship between income and racial status, it would have to be that that controlling for income, race was just a lot less important than it was before. Well, in this, we wanted to just say, well, how much less important would it have had to be able to reconcile these? Because we've got a 40% increase in the slope with respect to income, and a substantial narrowing must mean a pretty big change. But here is just some algebra that we did to just figure out, okay, so we can calculate, okay, what would the direct effect of race have to be controlling for income as a function of the observed black-white difference from the naive and the slope coefficient with respect to income. And then these are just the relationships between income and race coming from the current population survey. And what this is just saying is, in each of the grades, if we started out here at the beginning period and we just said, okay, suppose the slope with respect to income was going up over time, how much would the direct effect of race have had to change in order to produce the income gaps that we saw? And the answer is, it would have had the race gaps would have had to narrow, but actually more than narrow. They would have had to go change sign. So it would have to be that Black students controlling for income were outscoring white students of the same income in order to be able to reconcile sharply widening income gap with a narrowing race-based gap. Now, here I've taken another look at the Rearden data. I've just color coded them by the type of survey, by the age in which the students were being surveyed. The green dots represents, these are the observations from the NCES longitudinal data series. So the NLS 72, the high school and beyond, the National Educational Longitudinal Study, the ELS, and more recently, we just added in a data point for the HSLS. So so these dotted lines are identifying points that weren't available at the time that Sean published his paper in 2011. Here you see actually there was a downward shift. If we replicated Sean's methodology with the HSLS, we would have gotten the beginning of a downturn. The blue dots are from Sean's paper. They're just from early childhood studies. So we've clumped the studies by the age of the student and the type of survey being collected. So ECLS-K, ECLS-B, and then there's a more recent version of the ECLS. Again, this last blue dot wasn't available at the time Sean did his study, which would have suggested geometry. Now notice, remember I pointed out in the previous graph that it was the 2005 cohorts of 8th graders. After that, you started to see things go down. Well, that was the 1992 birth cohort, where if you look in this graph, you can see, and you look separately by age of the survey, you see some evidence here that even in Sean's data, things were starting to turn down. Okay. Now I just want to shift gears a little bit to just say, all right, so achievement gaps by race were narrowing. I've been arguing achievement gaps by income were also narrowing. Now, I just got a couple of slides here on a different paper where we just say, okay, so did any of this pay off for kids? Because we know 12th grade scores were flat during much of this period. And people have used the flatness of the 12th grade scores to say, well, gosh, yeah, maybe things were going up in 4th grade and 8th grade, but if there were no increases in 12th grade scores, maybe this was all just kids learning the same content, just learning it earlier in life. And so rather than just there are challenges with using the 12th grade scores. In particular, over time, there was an increase in high school graduation rates. So there were more would have been dropouts were around being tested in 12th grade that may have been dampening the increases. There, I've got my 17-year-old son is an 11th grader, and I've noticed, maybe you have too, that motivation goes, it's harder to get kids to take a test seriously as the older they get. So that's another possible explanation. So rather than try to wade into and make sense of the 12th grade scores, we just say, okay, for these states that saw big increases in 4th grade and 8th grade, what happened to the incomes of the people born in those states? And especially if we compare them to what happened to the incomes of people who were born in states that saw much smaller increases, like were the states that saw big run-ups in the NAEP scores, did the more recent cohorts seem to have higher earnings relative to the earlier cohorts than in the states with smaller increases? Okay, and so there's a related paper that the title's blocked by this screen sharing here, but it's an NBR working paper where we just looked within states. This graph just sort of captures the basic relationships, but in states with large increases in 8th grade NAEP, there were larger increases in log earnings. There were increases in high school graduation rates. There were larger increases in college going rates. There were declines in teen motherhood. There were declines in incarceration, and there were declines in violent crime arrests. So the states with big increases, it sure looked like that the folks, whether or not 12th grade scores moved, it sure looked like the kids in those states saw improved outcomes. Okay, so summing up, our results imply that there were large improvements in 4th and 8th grade math at all income levels, but especially for low-income students. There were also, our results imply large increases in 4th grade reading scores for low-income students. There was narrowing of racial ethnic gaps, that's undisputed. And more recently, we're arguing that those born in states with the largest increases in 8th grade NAEP have seen increased earnings and educational attainment and declines in arrests and teen motherhood. And so I remember I started out by just saying, look, this is largely a descriptive paper. I'm not, presenting evidence on, the effect of a particular program and policy. I'm not claiming now even what was causing these trends that we're seeing, although we're starting a project now where we're looking separately at the intercept and the slope with respect to income and see how they were related to the timing of state accountability and school finance reform. So maybe in the future, we'll be making stronger claims about what caused these trends. But it's hard to look at the full set of evidence here and not just ask yourself the question, did education reform really fail? Like, have we overlooked what would have been, maybe like the most important like social policy success of the last 50 years is that race gaps narrowing, income gaps narrowing, fourth and eighth grade achievement increasing, and substantially in some states. So North Carolina, my home state, saw, maybe because I left, this was happened since my time, but between 1990 and 2015, North Carolina saw a full standard deviation increase in eighth grade math scores. That's bigger than the black-white achievement gap was in 1990. Moved the whole state by that amount. And as we saw here, it looked like folks benefited in terms of earnings and educational attainment and so forth. So now we can speculate about like how this contrary narrative has sort of taken hold. I think if you asked most of our colleagues, has achievement been flat and have income-based achievement gaps been widening? I think you hear most people agree, and yet I think the evidence is contrary. And I think the negative effects of that have been that we've seen political leaders sort of step back from education as an area where they really want to bet their political capital. We've seen philanthropists making the same decisions. So if that narrative is wrong, that achievement's not improving and gaps are widening, it could have big implications for much more generally, not just as a history lesson, but for political leadership and philanthropic engagement going forward. Okay, so why don't I just stop there and just open up to questions and discussion?
And why don't I just kick it off with a question, and Paul, I would certainly turn to you as well as you have a question to get us started.
And anyone can jump in at any time. We'll start with the folks in the room and then monitor what's going on online. So Tom, one quick follow-up to your final comment there. I mean, I think one of the implications, maybe negative narrative ed reform, is a loss of confidence that we can actually do something about education. We threw everything at it and nothing happened. Well, maybe we should focus on other things. And I think you find the dialogue in schools these days on both the left and the right,
yes,
consuming a lot of the airtime that used to be focused a little bit more around sort of educational or academic, pursuits. So there's been that. I think that has been a little bit of a side or a unintended consequence of all this as well. But one question I have for you, which relates, there was the one slide in particular I was looking at, which was about the racial gaps, the white-black racial gaps. And it seemed to show, improvements that kind of leveled off at around 2010 or something like that.
Yeah.
So I think there's one question is, did ed reform over the last 30 years succeed or fail? I think your analysis suggests that it succeeded, in fact, significantly so. But then there's another question about, have we squeezed all the juice out of the fruit here, and now we need something else if we want to go further?
So you're right, Jim, that it wasn't just that the race gaps stopped narrowing around 2009. Much of the overall improvements slowed down after 2009, 2010. Now, I can't yet provide an explanation for that, because I can't explain why it was increasing in the first place. But one of the things, honestly, that we're going to be looking at is, to what extent does this does that just line up almost exactly with what we would have predicted if the No Child Left Behind Act was a big part of what was happening over time? That if what really matters is the number of grade levels in which you were exposed to a system where there was test-based accountability in force, that, you know, by 2009-10, those kids would have been spent the 8 years up to that point exposed to such a system. And so if the mechanism worked that way, you would expect a flattening out. But does open the question, okay, so what's needed next? Like what are the, you know, whatever the cause was, it wasn't a straight line up, you know, continuing improvement. What additional policy changes would be needed to, you know, get the improvements going again? And that's a discussion we ought to be having. We shouldn't be saying, okay, all these things that we've tried have had no effect. Actually, I think that you know, based on what I've been presenting, is wrong. But it's a valid question to ask. What do we need to do to move to the next stage?
Great. Oh, do you have a question?
Well, so Tom, I really agree with just about everything you've said. I do want to talk about the cause question a little bit, because Danny Shaquille and I have done this paper where we don't worry about gaps. We focus on how much more are people learning over time by different groups. But what we've done does allow you to look at gaps. So, you know, you're able to get the gaps very easily from what we've done. But what we show over the past 50 years, roughly the whole timeline that Reardon is talking about, extends a bit beyond what you're talking about here, but perfectly consistent with what you have. We see major increases in the performance of all students in mathematics of no less than the standard deviation. And the standard deviation change in education is massive. It's like about 4 years of learning. So that's a massive increase in learning in math, but a smaller increase in reading. There's about 20% of the standard deviation increase in reading. So, and that's consistent with what you're showing here. If you look at all your graphs, you're seeing big effects in math, less in reading. We also show bigger effects for minority students than for white students, whether you're talking about Asians, where you get the massive increase, or if you're talking about African Americans, where you get a very substantial increase relative to whites, and the same is true for Hispanic students. So you're seeing all of what you have here, but you're seeing more of it in math than in reading. And you're seeing more of it at the earliest grades measured, say 4th grade or 9 years of age, then you're getting at 8th grade, and much less than at 12th grade, as you pointed out. At 12th grade, things disappear. So then you say, well, is it the schools that are driving this, or is it something else? And we came to the conclusion that one of the things nobody's paying attention to is the fact that the human brain has improved over time. If intelligence in the 20th century improved by about a standard deviation. Just, you know, just about as much as math did. And math is a pretty good proxy for just IQ, because it's, you know, math problems you solve a lot by manipulating things abstractly. Whereas reading is much more content-based. You've got to actually be learning about the real world in order to do. So we think that there's, and why would the brain be improving massively over the course of the last century? Well, it's because mothers get better prenatal care, because kids when they're born get better medical services, better nutrition. There's fewer insults from the environment. So it's just been a massive change in the quality of life that babies experience, and that's when the brain develops. And just as kids are taller today, there's no reason not to think they aren't smarter. So to what extent do you think that that could be a driver of what you're finding here.
So, Michael, can you put the slides back on? So I can't, as I said, I can't say yet, which school policies or even whether the school policy drove what we saw so far. But I do not think it was solely the Flynn effect, that you're describing in that, Paul. And here's the reason. Let's see, can I go back? Yeah, so here you can see it, that at the state level, there were huge differences in the magnitude of these changes. So like North Carolina had the biggest increase in 8th grade math achievement. North Dakota, Montana, Nebraska, Missouri saw much smaller increases, like more like, like 0.1 or 0.2. And so like I would expect like the Flynn effect kind of things to be similar by state, like everybody's, increasing. So now it could be the kind of thing where, some part of it doesn't have to be an either or. It could be that some part of it is driven by Flynn effect kinds of things, increases in IQ over time. But it could also be that at least part of it is related to state policies. I just can't say yet.
Right.
But I'd be surprised if it was the Flynn effect. I'd be surprised to see the magnitude of the state differences that we see.
Right. Well, that's a good response. The counter response, if you see the same thing happening worldwide, if you look at the data from OECD, the PISA data, you'll see a narrowing of the gaps everywhere, and you'll see very steep increases in math and less in reading. And in terms of IQ, you're seeing it in Africa and Asia, Latin America. Yeah. So the flattening, but you're seeing a flattening of the growth in IQ in Northern Europe and in the United States. So some of the flattening could be due to the fact that, you've gotten all you can out of this intervention of better healthcare. So now, we can still improve healthcare for mothers and still we improve nutrition, but, we've gotten the big bite out of that apple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like I said, I can't say now what the cause was. And it's not an either or thing. Like, so for instance, here, it could notice that every state, by the way, this is worthwhile noticing that every single state by 2015 was scoring above the 1990 mean.
That's sort of
pretty,
that's sort of what I was saying.
well,
right.
But notice this variation in that.
Yeah, but
Some
the
it
big
grew
jump,
a lot.
The big jump up is actually bigger than the variation. Look at that graph.
Well, I don't know, like Florida versus New Mexico, like, so if you, so it could be that that policy's having an effect and there are these, general growth. So like, it could be that like there is something that is shifting the achievement overall, but state policy is driving the differences in between the states. It could be that state policy is not driving the differences between the states. I'm not saying it was, but I'm saying at least I think that's an open question, whether a good chunk of what we've seen is potentially a result of state policy and federal.
Other questions in the room?
I'm gonna ask you, Tom, the very last point you were raising about sort of states. Is there data that you could parse about what you've collected that might indicate differences among states at given levels of income variation or any other variables, so that you might see that certain states were more successful, or is that
So-
study for another?
There, as you probably know, there has been a literature over time on the effect of accountability policy, which test-based accountability, which uses the fact that different states started at different times with, even before No Child Left Behind made it a national law. And there's been a separate literature on the effect of school finance reforms. As if these two sets of policies were completely unrelated. Actually, here in Massachusetts, they were explicitly linked. So the 1992 school finance reform would not have happened without a simultaneous, change in the accountability policy. That was part of the political deal. And so because we have the different timing of these things, the state school finance reforms and the accountability policies, that's how we're going to try to parse out. And by using both at the same time, which may be make it even harder to see, but that's the way we're going to try to parse out, how much of what we see was due to state policy versus just overall trends. Does that answer your question? Yeah, Eric.
Sorry.
When you talk about income, are you thinking about also about like post-tax, post-transfer income? And also just there's the reason I ask is like there's so many other policy changes happening during this period, like welfare reform, Obamacare, state decisions about whether to go in on like Medicaid, children expansion. Like in Massachusetts, you mentioned the Massachusetts ed reform, but like Governor Romney did Romney Care. Like, so even the state variations, like there's the other policies are also varying.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to pin it down to one set of things versus not. But the point you make, I think, is important, is that in the paper version of this, I didn't talk about it during the seminar today, but in the paper version, in the literature review, we discuss the literature on the effects of the Medicaid expansions and other, food stamp expansion during the 90s. That, most of that literature was suggesting it was improving kids' outcomes. And which again is hard to, because those were going to lower income families, is hard to reconcile with a 40% increase in the slope. So yes, there were other things going on, but we think those other things going on may have been contributing to this flattening rather than it just makes it harder to believe the 40% increase in slope.
Probably goes under the future paper about what caused it. But I was thinking about like just a within education accountability policy variation. So one thing that states differed on was where they set their proficiency cut score, right? So that's sort of fact number one. Fact number two is that, there's, several papers now that show that teachers and schools really did respond to those cutoffs by shifting who they paid attention to, so that the kids near the cutoffs got a lot more attention than the kids further away. So if you combine those two things together, I wonder if you see in states that had lower, well, third fact, there's a correlation between income and achievement that you reminded of us today, but together, like those suggest that you should see like more narrowing of the income. If it was accountability and No Child Left Behind, then we should see more narrowing of the income gaps in states that had their cutoff lower.
Yeah.
or some relationship like that.
Yeah,
So,
no, that's an interesting idea.
but even like, now that Andrew and Sean have linked the NAEP to the state test, you might be able to say, like, we should see the effects. We could look for effects at particular points of the NAEP distribution that are linked to where states have their cutoffs, right? So,
Maybe since 2009,
Oh.
that's the problem with, for instance, the CETA data for this is they come in right when a lot of the action has
already gone.
already happened.
Anyway.
Andrew.
So I have a question about, I found one of your most compelling figures, sort of the within study versus the between study effect, right? So, because you got to use some of Sean's, if you want to go back to that slide, I found that's quite compelling. So which is to say, like, that it's the fact that we're comparing different studies with different potential outcomes, but that raises the question of why the gaps are different on those different measures. And I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on why the gaps of that later study were larger.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So here's one hypothesis. I don't know if this is right. But okay, so
Could you just repeat the?
yes,
Yeah,
so
now that we have the figure, we can do it. So,
Yeah.
I think you understand the question, but
Yeah.
you see the L sign, the HSLS line is going down, and the Eccles line is going down. But, so which is to say, it's what Sean, what I think, Tom, you're saying is that Sean's looking at a between study effect, but we should be looking at a within study effect.
within type of study.
Within type of study effect.
Yes.
But then that raises the question of why the studies are disagreeing about the magnitude of the gap, which is to say, if you look at the colored line, so the lower red line slanting
Yeah.
down, why is it so much lower than the higher blue, I guess, line that's above it?
So Michael, can you? Michael, you muted unless you, yeah, okay, so here's a hypothesis. So the ECLS is early childhood students, so these are, at least they're being tested in around kindergarten. And well, by the time, when you're in kindergarten, you've just been exposed to your parents, up until 5. There's no equalizing effect of schools. So it could be that that there's a stronger relationship between parents' income and your achievement, just because your parents have been your primary input until age 5. And that afterwards, maybe there's more narrowing. So these are being measured among folks who were like later 8th, 10th grade. That's one hypothesis. I don't know.
Can I comment on that? Because I've stared at this graph for days. The NLSY study is the best study that has the best measure of income that we know of out there. It was done by the Labor Department. Labor Department, they don't care about education, but they care a lot about income.
Yeah.
So they really measure income well. So you have a very precisely measured measure of income. And then the high school and beyond, which gets a much lower estimate than back there in 1960, whatever. But at almost the same day, those two tests are coming in with about, what is that, 40% difference in the estimate? It's enough to account for the whole change that Reardon's talking about. It's just this one gap between those two tests. So what does high school and beyond do? It's a great beginning. It's when survey research is still in its beginning stages, but they only have data from students, and so students are guessing what their parents, and instead of precise measure, you have a terrible measure. Well, whenever you have a terrible measure of an independent variable, it's very likely to be biasing downward your estimate. Now, the other study like that is prospects. You see, prospects is getting you a much lower estimate than the NLSY, which again is giving you a very precise estimate. So the prospect study has been thrown out by academics for, have you ever worked with the prospects data? No, it's just junk. it was done under a congressional mandate. It had to be implemented very quickly. An outfit ran it that didn't have the same sophistication that the Department of Education acquired and the Department of Labor has always had in recent years. So it just, nobody would pay any attention to it. So some of the dots and sexit in there, that is not even a national sample. That's
This
mothers walking into the hospital and they're being asked, would you be willing to participate in a survey? It's a selected sample of people who volunteer, and there's no pretension that it's nationally representative. So you've
that's why I
got a
left
mixture of,
gray.
of,
That's why they didn't get their own color.
that's why they didn't get their own color. So anyhow, that's, it's just a mixed bag up there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but at the time, like, it certainly made sense to try to do this, like to say, okay, let's, if we can't find a, if we're interested in income gaps and we can't find a longitudinal, a study that has student level income over a long period of time, it would make sense to say, well, let's go out and find all the studies that we can identify that collected apparent or collected income in some way and just look at the relationship. So I'm not faulting Sean for trying to do this. I'm just saying, like, I would say, okay, within that, it would have been useful to group it by study type. But which would have shown this kind of relationship. I'm also saying, like, okay, let's look at the name, because, like, yes, it's not the ideal measure of income, but at least it's a consistent measure of achievement over time, and we can apply the same approach to estimating income over time and just see whether, even if it's not perfect in any given year, if we're using the same approach to inferring income over this time period, do we see the relationship change? And I just think it's looking at this graph, it's very hard to conclude from this version that there's been a 40% increase. And in fact, I'd argue that there's some evidence of a downturn, and that's occurring right around the time that we see a downturn.
So why was this study so influential, Tom? It really shaped conversation for at least a decade. As you pointed out, Obama made use of it in a speech. The National Academy really relies solely on this study. I don't think there's any other evidence out there supporting it. So
I think it matches.
why is this so
I think it
influential?
matches what people see in the world. Like they see. So we're not saying income inequality didn't increase. Income inequality increased, and and people see out in the world, gosh, people are, there's a subset of people who seem to have really nice cars, and there are other people that have less nice cars, and the difference in car prices has been going up, and the difference in house prices has been going up. So I think it matches that story. But that's what makes what we're talking about all the more remarkable. Because what we're saying is, during this period, when there was a rapid increase in income inequality, the United States achieved something that was remarkable, and that looked like gaps were narrowing, despite the fact that income inequality was increasing. That's my hypothesis for why, is like it seemed to match the rest of the growing inequality that we see out there, and was hard to even imagine that there were forces at operation that were actually counteracting some of that, which, if it's right, is like super important. Yes.
I just wanted to add on, I believe that the rigor of the NIA increased over time as well. So even if there's growth over time, but the assessment is of higher level rigor, that shows even more progress and more.
Andrew used to be on the, Andrew O's here, used to be on the National Assessment Governing Board.
If you want to measure change, don't change the measure.
Yeah. So they've been trying to keep it as, the scores as stable as possible, over time. So I don't think what we're seeing was driven by changes in the the scale
actual
of the
assessment.
test.
Just one thought, you were mentioning. People have this sense that income inequality is growing and they're right because they see it. So this would be more speculative and more descriptive, but could you get an estimate of how much we would have expected the income gap to close if the variation in income hadn't been increasing?
Actually, so there,
So it probably closed less than it would have if the
Yeah.
variation hadn't been.
so there was, you're right. I was surprised though at, just given the slope. And given the difference in the 90th and 10, very little of this was driven by the 90 versus 10. Like even if the 90-10 had stayed exactly the same, it would have changed our story very, very little. It just because the slope is it's just the relation, the intercept and the slope, it just turns out it doesn't change that much based on changes in income.
Just one other little factoid, and that is if you look at the PISA data, you'll see a dramatic closing of the income gap. The PISA data starts in 2000 and we have it down to about 2018 or something like that.
And it was
And
mostly
and
because
it
of
shows,
decline.
it doesn't just show a flattening. It just shows it means that the income gap will totally disappear in the next 10 years, if indeed it continues to decline at the rate it's been documented as declining in PISA. Now, if you want to believe the PISA data, you should be really, really happy that because inequality is going to go totally away. Now, my guess is the NAEP data is better quality data than that. So I'm sure you're quite so optimistic.
But by the way, one thing that another, I think, dynamic here that I think has been an important part of the public perception of this, and that is that both sides of the education reform debate have been willing to stipulate that we're not making progress and that gaps are widening. They're just doing it for different reasons. So the folks who are arguing for the need for more reform, and I've done this, we point to the 12th grade NAEP flat. We talk about how much there's not been, progress over time. The folks on the other side, the folks who were less excited about the accountability reforms over the last 30 years are eager to argue that things are flat and gaps are widening, just be able to say that, look, what you're trying to do hasn't been working. So both sides of the education reform debate have been eager to embrace this story that things aren't getting better. And in fact, if anything, things are getting worse. And I think it has just added up to a corrosive view in the ability of any kind of policy to make a difference in education, and declining belief in the legitimacy of any thing that schools do. And so I think it's just short-term political expediency or policy expediency in making the case for the need for reform has, I think, had long-term consequences that I think we've underestimated. And like I said, I think it's led us, our evidence would say it's led us to overlook what may have been the most important, achievement of in the last 50 years, and that is narrowing educational inequality until the pandemic hit and overturned a lot of it. But
So Tom, that's probably a good place to end, except we do, and we are at time, but we do have a question online, and I think
Yeah.
to some extent the data may be in the, especially the state level information that was presented, but you may have some of this synthesized on the top of your head. This comes from Senator Jason Lewis, basically asking, what's the Massachusetts narrative or story in all of this? And is it essentially the same as the national one, or is it a little bit different?
so it's a little bit different. And I could send the senator some slides. So part of it is the same. So I remarked on North Carolina, the magnitude of North Carolina's improvement on 8th grade NAEP. Massachusetts also saw very large increases in 8th grade math achievement over time. And, we see evidence that we could calculate or estimate how much in terms of mean earnings, that increase in the NAEP scores represented for people who were born in Massachusetts. It's substantial, the amount of, if you take our estimates to estimate what this has meant for lifetime earnings, it's huge. But the part of the story that I think has been overlooked here in Massachusetts is that Massachusetts NAEP scores have been declining since 2019, but since like 2013, 2015. 2015, I think, primarily. And in substantial declines in some grades and subjects. So at least that part of the story is unusual. Most other states stayed flat after 2010.
We're still number one though, just.
Yes. I've got a whole long list of research studies that I'm ready to propose the minute Massachusetts drops. Right, yeah.
Well, it won't be on my watch. That's
Yeah,
good news.
right.
Anyway, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Tom. That was a really great discussion and presentation.
Thanks. Yeah.
Get the rest.
Great. Really great.